My name is Terry Campbell, and this is the Weekly Voice. Our subject today is, we're going to go back a little bit, but today we're going to talk about the Supreme Court decision made on the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act. You may know it as ObamaCare, but that's the official name of it. Now, I have studied the four Supreme Court decisions handed down on the mandated portion of ObamaCare. I will simply state their rulings, and then I will go through and try to explain them in their entirety. Okay, now, the United States Supreme Court on June 28, 2012, ruled on the mandated portion of the Affordable Care Act. Now, they actually had there was three of them that they ruled unconstitutional, which was unnecessary, but there was one decision they let down that said it was constitutional. Now, with a vote of 9-0, they ruled that the mandated portion of ObamaCare was unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. Now, also with a vote of 9-0, they ruled it was unconstitutional under the Necessary and Proper Clause. They also ruled with a vote of 7-2 that, which struck down the punitive rule. Now that's important, we'll get to that later. But they voted 5-4 that it was constitutional under the Taxing and Spending Clause. Now let's look at each of these rulings one by one. I'll explain what they are and give you my personal analysis. Okay, here we go. Let's look at the Commerce Clause. According to the Supreme Court ruling, the Congress cannot force people to buy anything against their will. Now, the Commerce Clause in the United States was written to regulate and settle disputes between the states. Okay, now that all of the medical insurance are within each state, the Commerce Clause does not apply, because it has to be cross-state borders. So therefore, it was ruled unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. Now, a lot of economists and politicians have been stating that it would be nice if you could buy medical insurance across state lines. Well, that's probably true, but let's rethink that a little bit, the long-term effect of that. Now, if you could buy insurance across state lines, that brings the Commerce Clause back in. And that will allow the federal government then to regulate health care per the Commerce Clause. And I don't think we want to do that. So now, just one more little thought here on the subject of the Commerce Clause. With this division, the Supreme Court has given the government permission to order all sorts of commerce as long as it is called a tax. Now, they can order you to do something, or they can order you not to do something, as long as it's called a tax. Now, we'll get into that a little more when we get down into what they did say was constitutional. Now, the Necessary and Proper Clause, well, that gets thrown out right off the bat, because the Necessary and Proper Clause is Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, which says only the enumerated, that the federal government can, the federal government can only implement the enumerated responsibilities of the federal government. Now, health care is not one of the enumerated clause, so this one got thrown out right off the bat as unconstitutional. Now, the punitive rule, which was also unconstitutional, which says it strikes down the punitive rule, which basically says that the federal government cannot penalize the states for not implementing ObamaCare. In other words, right now we get our Medicare and Medicaid payments from the federal government. Well, they collect our taxes, it goes to them, and they give us a piece of it back. Now, basically what this punitive rule being struck down means that any of the states that do not implement ObamaCare, they cannot be discriminated against, and funds cannot be withheld under penalty of law. Now that's what the punitive rule was. It says you can't do that. Now we're going to skip on to I got to read the article that's going to attach to this, because there's a lot more to it. But we're going to skip on. Now this is the one that allowed Obamacare to go forward. It was under the taxing and spending clause. Now, this really bothers me because here the Supreme Court is supposed to only interpret and enforce the law. In this case, they were making law because the Affordable Health Care Act was put in, was not a tax, okay? The penalty, this is the punitive, the penalty portion of it, it was a penalty, not a tax. Now the Supreme Court changed it to a tax in order to make it constitutional. Now that itself is unconstitutional for the Supreme Court to change what was voted on. Okay, now basically the Supreme Court was legislating. Okay, the rules, well see the other thing is, okay now, in defense of the Supreme Court, let's look at this a little closer. You know, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So let's look at this. This mandated is a tax. So let's see. The rules are written in the Internal Revenue Code, is enforced in the Internal Revenue Code. The tax on your failure to cooperate is collected by the Internal Revenue Service. The tax is paid on your 1040 federal income tax. The Congressional Budget Office takes the money in and accounts for it as a tax revenue pouring into the government funds. Now, I think this must be a tax because everything else is done under it's all implemented under the IRS. So it must be a tax. Okay, now this means that since it's a tax, by definition of the Supreme Court, a repealed bill is a revenue bill and now falls under the appropriation bill rules. Now this is important because now it only takes 51 votes to repeal Obamacare instead of the 60 votes. It only takes 51 votes because they called it a tax. Therefore, and it is also immune to a filibuster. A filibuster does not apply because it is a revenue bill. Now this is the first time in history that Congress has authorized a tax for not doing something, because it was a penalty when Congress put together the bill. Okay, but now when the Supreme Court said it was constitutional if it's called a tax. So now this is major, saying that they can now tax us for not doing something. This has never been done before. So now, if you refuse to, so basically what happens here, they can tax you if you, say, refuse to eat a balanced diet. They can tax you, say you don't brush your teeth in the morning. They can tax you. They can actually penalize you, but they will call it a tax, which says now they have given the federal government the authority to charge you anything they want as long as they call it a tax. Now this is just not right. Now let's just do a little bit of, like I said again, go back and read the article. It's got a lot more information in it. Now the entire health care law is the largest set of laws that has been instituted in the federal law in the last 20 years. There is 21 new laws, and there is, 21 new laws. Let me come down here. 21 new laws, and it's buried in 2,700 pages, and it also carries a price tag of over $2 billion. Well, actually, it's a lot more than that, because we've discovered there's a few other things that are hidden in there that we didn't know about. And the main losers in all of this is the hard-working American taxpayer. Everyone will be affected. But the biggest losers are the middle class. Anyone that makes $120,000 or less are the ones that are going to be paying for this. Okay. Now, don't forget the retired seniors. Now, in this ObamaCare bill, what it did, it took $565 billion out of Medicare and moved it into Medicaid to help pay for the small portion of uninsured of the population. Now I just want to say this one little part here. At my age, there's one part of this bill that really scares the bejesus out of me. Okay, and it's called the cost utility analysis. Now, what the press has been calling this is the death panels. Now, let's just take a little example. Let's say you're 72 years old and you had to have 2 stents put in your heart. And it's going to cost $144,000 to do it. Now, if the ObamaCare was enacted last year, okay, they would, under this analysis, this cost analysis, they would go through and see, now, if we authorize it, what will the government get back? What will society, can society recover the cost of this operation? And being 62 years old, probably from the analysis will come back and say no. And if that's the case, I would not be here today. No. The entire, without this tax mandate, which is the portion that they just ruled on saying it's constitutional, without this mandate part, the entire ObamaCare scheme collapses because it is not funded. So basically what I'm saying is let's look at this a minute. Here's a health care plan that forces us to purchase it or be fined. Okay, it was written by a chairman who did not understand it, was passed by a Congress that never read it, but exempted themselves from it, and signed by a clueless president with the funding administration administered by the treasury chief who did not pay his income taxes and was overseen by a surgeon general who is obese and financed by a country that is broke. Now, this just flat doesn't make sense to me. And that's the end of this, and have a good day, and God bless America.